The storm came up the mountain like a verdict. It touched Nurmengard first with rain, then with wind, then with the hard white glare of lightning that made the tower window bars appear and disappear like ribs around a dying thing. In the highest cell, an old man stood before the narrow slit of stone and counted the seconds between flash and thunder, not because he cared for weather, but because he had learned over the span of half a century to measure the world by disturbances. Thunder came honestly. Magic did not. When the shock passed through Europe, it did not resemble any honest thing at all. It entered the prison as a pressure beneath the skin of the wards, a thin, unclean note struck somewhere deep in the invisible architecture of spellcraft. The torches in the corridor guttered blue. The iron ring in the door gave a small metallic cry. High above the forests, lightning shivered over the black shoulders of the mountains, and Gellert Grindelwald, who had built enough fear in his life to know one shape from another, closed his eyes and listened. There were violences that belonged to war, to hatred, to panic, to political hunger, to the ordinary stupidities of men. And then there were violences that came from a soul forced beyond its proper form, and then dragged back into flesh by means so foul that the world itself briefly recoiled. Somewhere far from Nurmengard, somewhere across forests and rivers and borders he had once planned to erase, a wizard had returned from a death he ought never to have crossed. Grindelwald laughed once, softly, because the sound of it was monstrous and young at the same time. "So," he murmured into the storm, "that is what you are." The cell had been built for him, and therefore not quite against him. This was the secret of all prisons erected by ambitious men. They trusted the brilliance of their design more than they mistrusted the one who conceived it. Nurmengard had not always been a prison. Once it had been a declaration. The tower, the black stone, the terrible height, the motto carved above the gate in letters large enough to shame the mountain, "For the greater good," had been intended as a promise to history. Then 1945 had come, and the promise had turned inward. He had walked into his own monument as conquerors sometimes walked into mausoleums, and the doors had shut. He had not possessed a wand in more than 50 years. The first decade without one had taught him rage, the second economy, the third patience, the fourth an interest in silence so complete it nearly passed for penitence. In the fifth he had discovered something more useful than remorse: structure. Spellwork lived in stone after men forgot it. Wards aged. Runes weathered. Mortar cracked. Tiny weaknesses appeared, then deepened, then developed sympathies with the weather, the moon, habits of wardens, the pressure of winter. Over the years he had found them all. Not to use. Not at first. Merely to know. It had amused him to know, in the dark, what might break and how. Tonight the break came to him. He knelt with an old man's slowness and put both hands flat on the floor. The stone was cold enough to burn. Along the seam where slab met wall ran lines so faint no guard had ever seen them. A geometry scored with nail, spoon, chipped pottery, and once in fever with blood. Each mark alone meant nothing. Together, they formed an argument, and Grindelwald had always been a master of arguments. He whispered to the floor in a language older than the prison, and very nearly as old as his arrogance. Outside the door boots shifted. Somewhere below, a bell rang once, and stopped. The wards answered him unwillingly, the way an old scar answers weather. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the iron lock gave a tiny click. He stood, breathing harder than he would once have admitted, and stepped back from the door just as the inspection hatch scraped open. "Prisoner," came the guard's voice, irritated and drowsy. "What are you?" Grindelwald lifted his eyes. Age had hollowed him but not softened him. His hair, once bright, hung white at his shoulders. His face had been cut down by time until the bones showed plainly beneath the skin. Yet the eyes remained the same clear, terrible blue as in the wanted posters of a previous age, and when the guard met them at that distance, he faltered. not from magic but from the simple human error of remembering, too late, who occupied the cell. It was enough. The runes beneath the threshold answered the hesitation like a flock answering one bird. The guard's wand flew from his sleeve into Grindelwald's waiting hand so swiftly that the man did not at first realize it was gone. By the time he did, the old prisoner had already crossed the floor. "Sleep," Grindelwald said. The spell was inelegant. He had not held a wand in decades, and the wood, beech, underseasoned, provincial, resented him. Even so, the magic landed with force enough to send the guard collapsing sideways against the stone. Grindelwald caught the man's shoulder before his head struck the wall. He lowered him down carefully, breathing through a sudden stitch of pain beneath his ribs. "Still alive," he said to the unconscious figure. "I am not sentimental, merely old." The corridor beyond the cell was narrow, spiraling, torchlit in patches, with arrow slits admitting rain. He moved through it with the speed of memory rather than youth, one hand trailing along damp stone as if greeting an old enemy. Twice he heard voices below and turned aside into service recesses no one living remembered. Once he passed a window and saw the mountains open beneath him, black pines bent under storm, their tops writhing like a drowned army. At the third landing he met another warden coming up with a lantern. The young man froze. Grindelwald did not. He disarmed him, stunned him, and left him breathing on the stairs beside the shattered lantern glass, pale oil reflecting the lightning like liquid bone. At the fifth landing he paused before the great arch that led toward the inner gate. "For the greater good." The words loomed above him, rain streaking through the carved letters. He had stood under them once as their author, radiant with purpose and certain that history was a creature made to be ridden. He stood under them now in a dead guard's cloak with a stolen wand in his hand and old sins in every joint. "The greater good," he said softly, tasting both the lie and the longing in it. How magnificently young we were. He passed beneath the arch and entered the outer court. Nurmengard clung to the mountainside like a clenched fist. The lower walls dropped into a ravine that swallowed torchlight. Beyond the gate, the path wound along black rock and pine roots and vanished into weather. Alarm bells had not yet begun in earnest. The storm was still doing him the kindness of noise. Grindelwald drew the guard's cloak tighter about his shoulders and descended. He slipped once on wet stone and caught himself with a curse in German. At a turn in the path he looked back. The tower windows shone briefly white in the next lightning strike, then went dark again. Strange to feel no triumph. Stranger still to feel no real fear. He had expected, if escape ever came, that it would taste of vindication or greed or the hot immediate joy of power restored. Instead it tasted of cold rain, old marrow, and a grim curiosity sharpened into purpose. He reached the tree line before the alarm bells finally broke loose behind him. By dawn he had crossed 2 streams, transfigured the prison cloak into something less conspicuous, and taken shelter in the remains of a shepherd's hut. The mountains were clearing in the east. Pale light ran over the snowcaps and bled slowly down into the valleys. Grindelwald sat on a broken wall, the stolen wand balanced across both palms, and let the new century gather around him in sounds he did not know. Far below, on some muggle road cut through the foothills, there came the distant growl of engines. He had watched the world age from a cell. He had listened to it by rumor and paper, by the gait of guards, by the tone of visiting officials who wished to stare at a monster safely caged. He knew about wars. He knew about bombs. He knew that muggles, left to their own devices, had proved themselves amply capable of apocalypse without wizard help. He knew also that none of it had cured him of the belief that power congealed in the hands of the few, and was misnamed morality by the many. But the violence he had felt in the wards was not the violence of policy or even conquest. It was smaller, meaner, infinitely more diseased. It had the narrowness of obsession. It had the smell of a soul cut into parts for the sake of its own terror. He opened his eyes to the mountains and smiled without warmth. "If another dark lord walks the earth," he said to the thin morning, "then history will not be allowed the comfort of pretending it has already learned this lesson." He rose, tucked the stolen wand into his sleeve, and began the long descent toward Europe. He learned the century by theft. In Salzburg, he stole a coat from a railway platform and stood for an hour amid steam, iron, and Muggle announcements booming through loudspeakers, absorbing the modern world as if it were a language he had once spoken in youth and not heard since. In Munich, he took a newspaper from a café terrace and stared, with the dry inward amusement of the recently escaped, at photographs that moved and did not move, living faces in wizard print beside dead-eyed Muggle stillness. In Prague, he found one of his old safe houses converted into a solicitor's office and stood across the street watching clerks carry files through a doorway he had once used for curses, manifestos, and midnight plans. In Vienna, he discovered another reduced to rubble by war. The city had changed its stone and its grief, both. His followers, so far as they existed at all, existed in the manner of old republics and old scandals, remembered selectively, useful to the living only as warning or myth. A handful had died in prison camps. A handful had prospered. A few had changed names, faces, allegiances. One or two still kept hidden libraries, hidden cellars, hidden loyalties. Grindelwald visited none of them immediately. Age had taught him the value of surprise and the seduction of nostalgia, and he trusted only one of the two. It took him less than a week to understand the broad outline. A boy called Harry Potter had survived Lord Voldemort as an infant and embarrassed him again in adolescence. Cedric Diggory was dead. The British ministry had made its predictable mistake and chosen denial over alarm. Dark marks had been seen. Some of the old names had returned. Malfoy, Lestrange, Avery not. Severus Snape had reappeared in whispers thick enough to conceal more than they revealed. Igor Karkaroff, that shabby opportunist, had fled in fear of the master to whom he had once crawled and from whom he had later scuttled away. Tom Riddle, then. Tom Marvolo Riddle, grown all the way into monstrosity. Grindelwald knew the name, of course. Even in Nurmengard, one heard of certain boys from Hogwarts. Dumbledore had once mentioned him in a letter no one but Grindelwald ever saw, in the remote, impersonal tone he reserved for matters that worried him deeply. A brilliant child, strange from the first, contemptuous and hidden, hungry for ancestry and power. Grindelwald had found the description almost flattering in its omissions. Now he saw the finished article in newspapers, in frightened accounts from continental ouries, in the sudden tightening of magical borders, and the deepening unease among diplomats. A brilliant child had become a vulgar immortal. The first message he sent into Britain was not grand. He chose a plain owl from a weather-beaten post-stand outside Geneva and attached a note written in a narrow slanting hand on hotel stationery. No seal, no flourish, only a name at the bottom and an instruction. To Lucius Malfoy. By hand. He expected one of three results. Malfoy would destroy it in terror. Malfoy would rush it to his master. Or Malfoy, sensing an opportunity wrapped in danger, would do both. The answer came 2 nights later in the form of a black carriage that crossed the channel by methods less visible than legal, then delivered him under moonless sky to Wiltshire. Malfoy Manor stood where good taste and hereditary malice had shaken hands. Even at night it gleamed, pale stone above dark lawns, windows burning gold behind wrought iron balconies. The yews were clipped into shapes too disciplined to be beautiful. White peacocks drifted along the drive like arrogant ghosts. Grindelwald stepped down from the carriage in a black traveling cloak conjured from Austrian wool and silence, lifted his face to the house, and thought that if old blood wanted architecture to flatter it, this was exactly what it would build. Elegance with nowhere kind to stand. The front doors opened before he reached them. Lucius Malfoy met him in the hall with the expression of a man who has invited a wolf to dinner because the dragon already lives in the cellar. His hair, as famous as any politician's promise, hung immaculate over black velvet. His face, however, had lost all the softness of privilege and acquired the strained inward look of someone who had lately discovered that proximity to power was not the same as possession of it. "Mr. Grindelwald," he said. "Mr. Malfoy," Grindelwald returned. "Still blonde, I see. It is a comfort when a family remains faithful to at least one principle. Lucius's mouth tightened. He is waiting. Of course he is. The drawing room had been transformed into a war chamber without surrendering any of its vanity. Candles climbed the mantel in silver sticks. A fire hissed low under a green-veined marble surround. The long table gleamed like black water. Around it sat men and women in traveling cloaks, dark silks, and varying degrees of dread. Bellatrix Lestrange leaned forward like a flame-allowed human form. Her heavy-lidded eyes glittered with the kind of devotion that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with appetite. Severus Snape stood half apart in shadow near the far wall, severe and still, his face giving away nothing except intelligence and the effort of concealment. Others Grindelwald knew by sight, by family, by atmosphere. At the head of the table sat Tom Riddle. For a single moment the old man simply looked at him. It was not the face he would have chosen. Vanity, Grindelwald reflected, generally made people more human in their self-presentation, not less. But vanity of a certain diseased kind could drive a man towards symbols, and Riddle had made himself into the symbol he most desired, not of majesty, but of rupture. The skin was pale to the edge of translucence. The nose had flattened into slits. The eyes burned with that unmistakable red peculiar to magic too long turned inward upon itself. There was power in him, yes. Power enough to warp the air. Yet the deeper impression was not strength. It was damage. Nagini lay coiled at the table's base, scales catching the firelight like wet metal. Riddle's gaze moved over Grindelwald slowly. "You took your time. And you took liberties with death," said Grindelwald. "Both choices appear to have inconvenienced the world." Bellatrix half rose with a hiss. "How dare you?" Riddle lifted one finger. She sat at once, though resentment trembled through her like music through a wire. "You know who I am," Riddle said. "Yes," said Grindelwald. "You were more interesting on paper." A silence followed, thin and dangerous. Then, unexpectedly, Riddle smiled. It transformed the room not by warming it, but by sharpening everyone else's fear. "I was told prison had made you wise. Prison made me patient. Wisdom is a slander invented by the young for anyone old enough to have survived his own ideas." "You survived defeat," said Riddle. "A distinction." "I survived Albus Dumbledore," Grindelwald said. "The distinction matters." There it was. The name moved through the chamber like a draft. Snape's eyes flicked up once, and then away. Bellatrix's lip curled. Lucius went a shade paler. Riddle's smile did not alter, but something colder entered it. "Why are you here?" he asked. Grindelwald did not bow. He did not sit until he chose to. He crossed to the near end of the table and rested his gloved fingers lightly on the polished wood. "Because I felt the world recoil," he said. "Because Europe is whispering your name badly and Britain is pretending not to hear it. Because you have achieved the difficult vulgarity of returning from death and appear determined to waste the accomplishment on schoolboy vendettas." A faint rustle circled the room. Even Bellatrix looked shocked. Riddle's expression remained unreadable. "And what," he said at last, "would you recommend instead?" "A state," said Grindelwald. "Institutions. International leverage. Fear distributed intelligently. You have an army. You do not yet have a world fit to be ruled." Bellatrix laughed sharply. "He thinks this is politics." "It is politics," said Grindelwald without looking at her. "War is politics stripped of etiquette." "We do not need a lecture from an old failure," she snapped. Now he did look at her. "My dear lady, I do not believe anyone in this room needs a lecture on failure from me. You all appear to have brought your own examples." Lucius stared at the table. Someone at the far end made a strangled sound that might have been the beginning of laughter or terror. Riddle's attention never wavered. "And you presume I would welcome you?" "No," said Grindelwald. "I presume you are curious. Curiosity is the one vice shared by every wizard who ever mattered." Riddle rose. He was not tall, but power around him exaggerated height the way thunder exaggerates distance. He came slowly down the length of the table until only a few feet separated them. Grindelwald felt the probing edge of legitimacy like a nail tested against old lacquer. He let the younger man touch surfaces and nothing deeper. Let him see stone walls, the mountain storm, a laughing room in Godric's Hollow long ago, Albus' face turned in candlelight, prison years, newspapers, trains. Not the center. Never the center. Riddle withdrew first. "How fascinating," he said. "You have become sentimental." "No," said Grindelwald. "Only selective." Nagini lifted her head and tasted the air. As she did, a wrongness rippled through the room so subtly that none of the others reacted. Grindelwald did. It was there again, the unclean fracture he had felt in the prison wards. Not in the snake alone, not in Riddle alone, but in the current between them. Something tethered, something torn and fastened. He gave no sign that he had noticed. At last Riddle gestured toward an empty chair. "Sit," he said. "Advise me." Grindelwald lowered himself into the chair with the measured care of age. "Temporarily," he said. Bellatrix's voice sharpened to a blade. "My lord." "Be quiet, Bellatrix." She obeyed, but her eyes never left the old man. Around the table, the meeting resumed in altered form. Reports came from the ministry, from Nocturne Alley, from Azkaban sympathizers and disaffected werewolves, from bribed shopkeepers and frightened informants. Grindelwald listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, people listened despite themselves. He asked different questions than they expected. Not how many did you kill, but which departments spoke to which. Not who resisted, but who hesitated. Not where are the Aurors strongest, but which ports are least supervised by the Department of International Magical Cooperation. He ignored blood purity except when it interfered with efficiency. He ignored rhetoric unless it could become law. Before an hour had passed, even those who despised him were leaning toward his intelligence like travelers toward a fire they could not trust. Only Snape did not lean. Snape watched. Once, late in the meeting, their eyes met across candlelight. Grindelwald saw a mind braced behind layered doors, a talent for concealment so disciplined it was almost monastic, and under that discipline, a pain of such density it had become structural. He thought, not without amusement, that Albus still selected his agents with an almost insulting fidelity to complexity. When at last the room began to empty, Riddle remained standing beside the fire. "You will stay here," he said. "For tonight," said Grindelwald. "For as long as I decide." Grindelwald rose, then sighed interestingly. Riddle's smile returned, thinner than the edge of broken glass. "I decide fatally." "Yes," said Grindelwald. "That is what concerns me." He followed Lucius from the drawing room toward the guest quarters prepared for him in the east wing. Behind him the fire cracked, Nagini's scales whispered over polished wood, and Tom Riddle stood at the center of a house full of hereditary predators, looking less like a sovereign than like an idea of sovereignty that had been carved too sharply to survive human use. Grindelwald had come to weigh the new Dark Lord. He found him magnificent in the way plague could be magnificent from a sufficient distance, powerful beyond argument, brilliant, narrow, broken. It interested him. It repelled him. Above all, it promised catastrophe. Albus Dumbledore knew before the letter was opened. The owl had flown hard from the continent. Its feathers were dark with rain, its talons muddy, its yellow eyes exhausted in the particular way of creatures that have crossed too much weather carrying too much urgency. Fawkes, bright on his golden perch, turned his head and made a low questioning sound as the bird settled onto the arm of Dumbledore's chair. Dumbledore took the envelope from its leg and felt, through paper, the old private dread one does not experience often in life, and should be grateful for that. He had known fear in many forms. Fear for others. Fear of his own capacity. Fear of the seductive nobility with which evil sometimes clothed itself before entering a room. This was not panic. It was recognition. The seal had been broken and resealed at least twice in transit. Austrian Auror business, then an unofficial forwarding charm, then a personal hand he recognized from the pressure alone. He opened the letter and read it once in silence. Then again. Minerva McGonagall, who had entered 3 minutes earlier intending to argue about educational decrees, and had stopped at the look on his face, said very quietly, "Albus?" He folded the letter with the kind of care that belongs to injury. "He has gone," he said. She frowned. "Gone where?" "Out." There were only a few people in the world before whom Albus Dumbledore ever allowed a pause to reveal him. Minerva was one. She set down the sheaf of parchment she carried and came closer. "Whom do you mean?" He looked past her to the office windows. The evening was deepening over Hogwarts in shades of blue and iron. Far below, tiny figures crossed the grounds toward supper. Somewhere in the castle a door slammed and was immediately opened again by giggling first years. The ordinary life of the school went on with an almost indecent confidence. "Gellert Grindelwald," he said. She went still. Not many living witches and wizards understood what that name meant to him. They understood what it meant to history, certainly. The last great European terror before Voldemort, the architect of bloodshed, the revolutionary tyrant defeated in legend by Albus Dumbledore in 1945. But history always simplified what it could not comfortably hold. History liked duels. History liked dates. It did not know what to do with summer rooms, shared books, ambition spoken in the language of justice, or the fact that one could love and fear the same human being without either feeling canceling the other. So history had kept the famous parts and let the truth molder in private. "He escaped?" Minerva asked. "Apparently." "How?" Dumbledore's mouth bent, not quite into a smile. "Nurmengard was designed by a man inclined to admire himself. You think he always knew how?" "I think," said Dumbledore. Gellert never entirely ceased believing he might one day require the knowledge. Minerva took this in with a sternness that, in lesser company, might have become horror. "Then we warn the Ministry at once." "Yes," said Dumbledore, "though I expect it will choose not to hear." Her eyes sharpened. "You think he is coming here?" "No." He touched the folded letter with one finger. "I think he is going where power is gathering." Neither of them needed the name spoken. The office clock ticked. Fawkes tucked his head under one wing and then lifted it again, unsettled by the tension in the room. On the desk, the silver instruments spun and whirred, reflecting candlelight in broken circles. Dumbledore sat down slowly. "Send Severus to me tonight," he said. Minerva's brows drew together. "At once." She left without further question. When the door shut, the room seemed for a moment too full of other years. Godric's Hollow in summer. Bathilda Bagshot laughing over tea. A boy with bright hair and impossible certainty leaning over maps spread on a table. The sense, intoxicating and fatal, that there might exist a moral shape to power if only brilliant enough people arranged it. Dumbledore closed his eyes and let the memory pass through him like old weather. By the time Harry Potter was shown into the office the following evening, the headmaster's face had recovered its habitual composure. But Harry, who had been starved of Dumbledore's attention for months, and therefore watched every movement now as if it might explain the neglect, noticed the difference at once. There was a new strain about the eyes. Not fatigue. Not exactly. Something more alert and more distant together, as though Dumbledore were listening at every moment for a sound no one else could hear. Harry stood by the desk, clutching the chair back and trying not to look as angry as he felt. "You wish to see me, Professor?" "Yes, Harry." Dumbledore indicated the seat. "Please." Minerva was there as well, upright beside a bookcase, her mouth compressed into that line which meant she disapproved of several things at once. Outside, the high windows evening sat blue over the grounds. Fawkes shifted on his perch and let out a low note. Harry sat. He had expected some discussion of Umbridge, perhaps, or of his latest detention, or of the dreams that continued to trouble him, and which no one seemed interested in discussing except Snape, who discussed them only to sneer. Instead, Dumbledore studied him for a long moment and said, Have you seen any new faces in your dreams lately? Harry blinked. What? In the visions, said Dumbledore. When you find yourself where Lord Voldemort is. The name still made most adults flinch. Dumbledore's calm use of it always landed on Harry like a hand steadying a wobbling object. I don't know, Harry said. Sometimes there are other people. Death Eaters. I don't always see them properly. Dumbledore inclined his head. If you notice anything unusual, you will tell me. Harry's anger surged. I would tell you lots of things if you ever actually talked to me. Minerva made a small warning noise, but Dumbledore only sighed. You are right to be angry with me, he said. Nevertheless, I ask it. Harry stared. This was not the reaction he had prepared for. Why? He demanded. What's happened? Dumbledore looked, just for an instant, very old. Anno Danger has entered a new war. Minerva shot him a glance, but he did not elaborate. Harry frowned. The words meant something and nothing. What old danger? Dumbledore's gaze moved to the fire. A man I once knew too well. Harry waited. Dumbledore did not continue. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. It would be nice, Harry said at last, if people would stop telling me things that sound important and then acting like I'm 5. The corner of Dumbledore's mouth twitched, but whatever humor might have answered him never arrived. Yes, he said. It would. Harry left the office more frustrated than when he had entered it. On the spiral stairs he heard voices below and flattened himself against the wall instinctively as the door opened and Severus Snape ascended. Snape's face, thin and bitter in the torchlight, did not turn Harry's way. He moved past like a black blade and disappeared into the office without acknowledging him. Harry hesitated, then crept down 2 steps and listened. The words that reached him were few. Confirmed, then? Dumbledore said. Yes, Snape answered. Willingly. A pause. He serves no one willingly, said Snape. That is precisely what makes him useful. Harry heard nothing more. Footsteps approached and he fled the rest of the way down the stairs. That night, in the Slytherin common room, at the Ministry, at Grimmauld Place, and in a dozen hidden rooms across Europe, Grindelwald began to do what he had come to do. He did not preach. He did not rant. He did not resurrect the slogans of his youth. He reorganized. He asked for lists of department heads, sympathizers, foreign contracts, fireplace regulations, international courier routes, owl inspection schedules, shipping manifests from wizarding ports, old-school ties among pureblood families, recent demotions in the Department of Magical Transportation, and the names of every underpaid clerk in the British Ministry of Magic, with Bellatrix Lestrange called it bureaucracy, with contempt so naked it might have been innocence. Grindelwald corrected her only once. No, he said, in the library at Malfoy Manor while she prowled between the tables like a caged predator. Bureaucracy is what happens when power forgets it has a purpose. This is architecture. She laughed in his face. Mudblood offices, quotas, owl routes. You think like a clerk. I think, said Grindelwald, like a man who prefers victories that continue being useful after the screaming stops. You sound like Dumbledore. He looked up from the parchment in his hand. You have no idea what either of us sounds like. She flinched from the calmness more than she would have from anger. Riddle, by contrast, listened. Not because he agreed with everything, but because even vanity respects results. Within weeks, whispers in the ministry thickened into hesitations. International correspondence slowed. Flu routes developed inexplicable failures. 3 minor officials in the Department of International Magical Cooperation resigned on the same day for different personal reasons, all of which Grindelwald had arranged. An order transfer to Dover never arrived because the paperwork authorizing it disappeared into a filing system whose custodians had quietly been bribed, blackmailed, or enthralled. Nothing dramatic. That was the beauty. Terror was most effective when it first resembled inconvenience. At supper one night, with lightning flashing faintly beyond the windows of Malfoy Manor and Nagini coiled near the hearth, Riddle said, "You dislike my followers." Grindelwald spread marmalade on toast with maddening precision. "I dislike enthusiasm divorced from intellect. The condition is epidemic." "Nani? Hi. Ale." Riddle's red gaze narrowed in amusement. "And yet they fear me." "They fear annihilation," said Grindelwald. "Fear you if you like. It amounts to much the same thing." "What do you fear?" Grindelwald buttered the toast. "Waste. Daria." Riddle laughed. "That was when Dumbledore, in Hogwarts, receiving reports from Snape and contacts abroad, understood the full shape of the problem. Voldemort had found not an equal, perhaps, but something nearly as dangerous to a wounded nation. An elder strategist with patience, international memory, and no interest in the sentimental provincialism of blood purity, except as a lever to move fools. If Tom Riddle had been a storm, Gellert Grindelwald was the map of where storms broke cities. And in the midst of all that, Harry Potter dreamed. Not every dream showed him the same room. Not every dream made sense upon waking. But once, near dawn, he saw Voldemort standing before a fire with someone else beside him. A tall old figure in black, silver hair lit at the edges, a profile carved sharp as a blade. The voice that spoke was dry, almost amused. "Prophecies are traps for vain men, Tom." Harry woke with his scar burning and the name lodged in his head like a shard of ice. Tom Dot. He did not know why it frightened him more than Lord Voldemort. The winter of denial gave way to the spring of lies, and then to the summer in which lies became impossible to maintain. All through Harry's 5th year, the atmosphere in Britain had taken on the strained metallic quality of a house in which everyone hears footsteps upstairs, but insists the place is empty. Dolores Umbridge enforced the Ministry's version of calm with sugar and cruelty. The Daily Prophet sneered. Cornelius Fudge vacillated between panic and vanity. Dumbledore grew more remote. Snape, when forced to teach Harry occlumency, did so as if each lesson were a duel between rival hatreds. Meanwhile, the hidden machinery Grindelwald had set in motion continued its cold work. It was not he who terrorized families in the night, nor he who left the dark mark over corpses for theatrical effect. Bellatrix, Greyback, the loyal brutes and ecstatic sadists did those jobs with relish. Grindelwald preferred the invisible humiliations that softened a country before conquest. A regulation delayed here. A key official compromised there. A budget misdirected. An aura deployment arriving half an hour too late because the flu monitoring records had been altered by a clerk whose son was in debt. The sort of sabotage governments committed against themselves, without noticing until the crisis fully arrived. "Your followers mistake spectacle for power," he told Riddle one evening as they stood over a table strewn with ministry diagrams. "Murder is a message only if the recipient survives to read it. And if I wish the recipient dead, then choose a better recipient." Riddle turned his wand between elegant white fingers. "You speak as though conquest is administration." "Conquest," said Grindelwald, "is the vulgar beginning. Administration is what decides whether history remembers a reign or an interruption." Riddle was quiet a moment. Then, "And yet Albus Dumbledore interrupted you." Grindelwald's expression did not alter. "Yes. What did that teach you?" The old man looked down at the spread of parchment. Names, departments, roots, favors owed. That charisma without timing is vanity. That love, in a certain kind of man, can become a form of discipline. That defeat clarifies. "None." Riddle smiled without warmth. "I do not intend to be clarified." "No," Grindelwald thought. "You intend never to be judged at all." Harry's dreams sharpened as the school year darkened. Sometimes he saw a corridor. Sometimes a door. Sometimes a room where Voldemort's anger moved through others like flame through dry grass. Once he saw Bellatrix kneeling by a hearth while the pale old man from before stood at the mantel, one hand tucked behind his back, speaking in a voice that made her shake with rage. "This obsession with blood is useful only because lesser minds need flattery," he said. "Power cares very little what it inherits as long as it commands." Bellatrix spat an epithet Harry had never heard before and woke with the taste of it in his own mouth. He told Hermione. She searched the library. 3 days later, she came to him looking pale. "There was a dark wizard before you know who," she whispered in an empty classroom. "Well, lots, obviously, but one of the worst. His name was Grindelwald. Gellert Grindelwald." The name landed in Harry's memory like a key in a lock. Tom Dut. Grindelwald. Albus had set an old danger in a new war. "What was he like?" Harry asked. Hermione hugged the books tighter. "Brilliant. Revolutionary. Horrible. He wanted wizard rule over muggles, but not in exactly the same way. He was defeated by Professor Dumbledore." Harry stared past her to the rain blurring the window. A strange unease opened in him. Voldemort was terrifying partly because he seemed singular, as if evil had reached a pure enough pitch in him to require its own category. But there was something more disturbing in the idea that he had found company in history, that the old world, instead of recoiling from him, had opened a door and sent one of its ghosts to advise. The night the false vision of Sirius broke over him, Harry was too desperate to remember any lesson about manipulation, prophecy, or history. He saw Sirius in pain at the Department of Mysteries and ran headlong for rescue. Ron came. Hermione came. Ginny, Neville, Luna. All the brave, foolish young who always moved toward danger when someone they loved appeared to be in it. The journey to London, the thestrals over the dark city, the entry into the ministry after hours. All of it unfolded with the unreal conviction of nightmare logic. The Hall of Prophecy was colder than winter. Endless shelves rose into darkness, lined with glass spheres glowing faintly in the black. Harry heard only his own breath and the scrape of shoes over stone. Then came the ambush. Death Eaters spilled from shadow, masked, wand light flashing. Lucius Malfoy's drawl slid across the room like oil. Bellatrix's laughter rang sharp enough to crack bone. Prophecy orbs shattered as spells struck the shelves, and the air filled with silver whispers, lost voices, fragments of fate pouring onto the floor. Harry never saw Grindelwald enter. Later, he would not be certain he had seen him at all. But in the chaos between one curse and the next, between Hermione crying out and Neville's broken wand spurting sparks, he caught sight of an old man standing beyond the nearest archway, cloaked in black, face cut pale by red and green light. He did not attack. He watched. Bellatrix drove Sirius back through the chamber with gleeful malice. Harry shouted, fired spells half-aimed. Then the curse struck. The veil trembled. Sirius was there and not there, and the world tore. Grief is rarely immediate. First comes refusal, then pursuit. Harry's mind flung itself after his godfather into the vast, impossible silence beyond the arch, while his body ran forward and was dragged back and fought and screamed. Bellatrix fled. Harry chased. Stone rooms blurred past. The atrium exploded open around them in fountain spray and shattered statues. Then Dumbledore arrived. There are moments when time stops out of sheer professional respect. The duel between Albus Dumbledore and Lord Voldemort in the Ministry atrium was one of them. Gold fire, silver glass, conjured shields, animated statues, water rising like a living hand from the fountain. Magic not as weapon alone, but as philosophy made visible. Harry, trapped at the edge of it by pain and astonishment, saw Voldemort at his most vicious and Dumbledore at his most terrible. And from the dark, near a side colonnade, unseen by all but perhaps one man, Grindelwald watched. The last time he had stood in the presence of such force, Albus had faced him across another battlefield, younger both and more certain in their opposite convictions. Now Dumbledore moved with the same impossible balance between gentleness and command, never wasting a spell, never giving anger the dignity of ownership. Riddle fought like an intellect possessed by panic whenever it met resistance. Even his brilliance curdled toward fury. When the younger Dark Lord attempted to possess Harry, it was not power that drove him back out again, but the boy's grief, love, and refusal. Grindelwald saw the recoil in Riddle's face and understood something then that he had not fully admitted before. Tom had not merely mutilated his own soul in the pursuit of immortality. He had narrowed it until it could no longer endure what made other people worth ruling or worth saving. He could terrify. He could dominate. But he would always, in the deepest sense, flee. The Aurors burst in. Fudge arrived. The secret ended. Voldemort vanished in a blast of darkness and fury, taking Bellatrix's failure and Harry's hatred with him. Dumbledore turned to the boy. The world lurched forward again. Later that night, at Malfoy Manor, the atmosphere in the drawing room had all the coherence of a battlefield after rain. Bellatrix knelt, shaking with rage and adoration. Lucius stood rigid, stripped bare by disaster. Others watched the Dark Lord with the hopeless fixed gaze of people listening for the weather inside a tyrant's breathing. Riddle's wand hand trembled once before becoming still. "The prophecy is gone," he said. No one answered. At the far side of the room, Grindelwald rested one shoulder against the mantel and looked into the fire. "I did say," he remarked softly, "that prophecy is a poor foundation for strategy." The room froze. Bellatrix sprang to her feet, face contorted. "You old coward, you stood aside." "Yes," said Grindelwald. "As did you, when it most mattered." She screamed and raised her wand, but Riddle's voice cracked across the room before the spell formed. "Enough." Bellatrix stopped, chest heaving. Riddle turned his red gaze on Grindelwald. "Do not advise me about the boy again." "Gladly," said Grindelwald. "I dislike repeating myself to the obsessed." For a heartbeat, the air thickened with imminent violence. Then Riddle smiled, and the smile was worse. "Do not mistake tolerance for trust. Do not mistake criticism for disloyalty," said Grindelwald. "The two are not always enemies." Riddle moved closer until the firelight carved every inhuman angle of his face. "You are here because I permit it." "No," said Grindelwald. "I am here because you are not yet equal to the scale of your own ambition." Bellatrix made a sound like a knife drawn slowly from cloth. Riddle stood very still. Then he laughed. A brief, dry sound entirely emptied of mirth. "Go," he said to the others. When the room had cleared but for Nagini and the two of them, he asked, "Do you believe yourself wiser than I am?" Grindelwald considered. "Yes." Riddle's eyes gleamed. "Then perhaps the pleasure of killing you must be delayed." The old man met the gaze without blinking. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps the pleasure would be yours only once, and the consequences mine forever." He left the room with the faint hiss of the snake following him in thought if not in movement. That summer Britain finally saw what Dumbledore had been trying to tell it. The masks came off. The dead multiplied. The Ministry could no longer pretend. Yet even as terror became public, Grindelwald's private certainty deepened. Tom Riddle could shatter the world. He could not shape one worth inheriting. The distinction was not moral. Grindelwald had long since forfeited the luxury of morality as innocence. It was structural. And structures, once understood, could be broken. It was nearly dawn in Vienna when Grindelwald took the Ministry Annex without breaking the chandelier. The building stood on a narrow street hidden behind a Muggle embassy and an illusion of respectable stone. To wizarding eyes, it revealed itself differently. Copper domes, carved lintels, rune-worked windows black against the paling sky. The night clerk at the entrance did not see the three enchantments settle over him in as many breaths. By the time he looked up from his ledger, his wand lay harmlessly in the umbrella stand, and the memory of why he had meant to stand had slipped like sand through fingers. Grindelwald entered with 6 companions and made no speech. That was Bellatrix's disappointment from the first. She had insisted upon accompanying the operation because she smelled significance and expected spectacle. Instead, she found the old man moving through corridors with infuriating precision, sealing fireplaces before anyone could flew for aid, silencing alarms before they could ring, transfiguring one set of doors into a brick wall, and another into a servant's pantry, charming owl cages so that any bird released from them circled back in confusion. The Aurors on duty were disarmed, bound, and left breathing. A department head attempting resistance was stunned, healed where she struck the marble, and placed upright in a chair with her own wand on the desk beyond reach, but not beyond sight. "This is absurd," Bellatrix snarled as Grindelwald drew lines of white fire along a map room threshold. "Why keep them alive?" He did not look up. "Because they know their filing systems better than their replacements will. You should kill the resistors. I prefer them grateful." She laughed in disgust. "Grateful? For having survived," said Grindelwald. "People will forgive their conquerors astonishing things if the alternative is being noticed by their conqueror again. By sunrise, the Annex belonged not to Britain exactly, nor wholly to Voldemort, nor in any official sense to Grindelwald, but to Leverage. International correspondence routes passed through it. Sanction approvals passed through it. Quiet diplomatic messages, intelligence on border movements, memoranda concerning extradition and foreign aura cooperation, all now sat neatly catalogued under wards that answered to the old wizard's hand. It was not a massacre. It was a vein cut in the right place. When Riddle arrived 2 hours later, having crossed half a continent with the impatient economy of magical travel, he walked through the captured hall in silence. Clerics sat stunned but unharmed. Aurors glared from conjured restraints. The ministerial portraits had been veiled. On the central table lay 12 folders sorted by country, department, and weakness. Riddle touched the edge of one folder. "Efficient." Said Grindelwald. Bellatrix's fury had not cooled. "My lord, we could have made an example of them." Riddle did not take his eyes off the papers. "He has." Her mouth tightened. Grindelwald, who knew the value of not smiling at the wrong moment, merely adjusted the cuff of his glove. That operation became the pattern. In Prague, a records office vanished overnight and reappeared 3 streets away, with every file on international magical law missing from its archives. In Brussels, 2 senior officials discovered, too late, that the undersecretary who had poured their wine for 19 years had been enchanted 3 months earlier, and had spent the intervening time copying their private correspondence for Grindelwald's people. In Oslo, a flu junction failed during a storm and never fully recovered, isolating northern Auror travel for critical days. In Bulgaria, an old family debt brought a junior minister quietly to heel. Britain's war, which had once seemed localized in its arrogance, began to grow European nerves. And at Malfoy Manor, old fault lines sharpened. Riddle valued results. Bellatrix valued devotion. Lucius valued survival and had become poor at disguising it. Yaxley valued proximity. The Carrows valued cruelty because it was the only distinction they had. Snape valued concealment above being understood, and therefore gave no one the comfort of interpretation. Grindelwald valued structure. These loyalties could coexist only while useful. One night, after a council regarding ministry infiltration in Britain, Bellatrix cornered him in the library between shelves of genealogies and obsolete curses. "You sneer at blood," she said. "At houses, at lineage, yet you dare advise him." Grindelwald slid a volume shut and looked at her over the top of his spectacles. He had acquired the spectacles in Geneva partly because age made reading at length tiresome, and partly because they annoyed everyone around him. "I do not sneer at blood," he said. "I sneer at provincialism disguised as doctrine. Your family trees are useful as symbols. That is all." "No, no." She took a step nearer. "Pure blood is everything." "Pure blood," said Grindelwald, "is a story frightened people tell themselves when merit proves inconvenient." Her wand was in her hand before thought fully formed. His own was there first. The spell he cast did not injure. It froze the air between them into a sheet of glass-clear force, and Bellatrix found herself staring at her own distorted reflection, trapped inches from her face. "When you threaten me," said Grindelwald, still almost gentle, "do be sure you are not merely advertising your limits." The force dissolved. She stumbled back, breathing hard, half in hatred and half in the exhilarating shock of not having died. He turned away from her before the emotion could decide which it wished to become. Later that same night, Snape came into the library and closed the door behind him. No one else ever closed doors softly at Malfoy Manor. The house encouraged drama. Snape's quietness, therefore, felt more deliberate than any slammed entrance could have done. "You are making enemies," he said. "I arrived among them," Grindelwald answered, not looking up from the parchment spread across the desk. "A pleasant economy." Snape's black eyes rested on him. "Bellatrix will push until he permits her to try." "Yes. You appear unconcerned." Grindelwald capped his ink bottle with exactness. "On the contrary, I am deeply concerned. She is very tiresome." There was the smallest possible pause. In another man, it might have been the beginning of a smile. In Snape, it became something more like the temporary easing of pressure in a sealed vessel. "You know," Snape said, "that he watches you." "Of course he does." "And you watch him." "Of course." Snape moved to the window. Outside, moonlight silvered the lawns and the ghost-pale peacocks. "Then perhaps you have noticed," he said, "that there are matters even he does not speak plainly of." Grindelwald's gaze lifted at last. "Many." Snape turned back. Their eyes met across candlelight and old books. No explicit understanding passed between them. Neither trusted the other. But each recognized in the other a profession of concealment elevated into art. "You would have done well in another generation," said Grindelwald. "I have done badly enough in this one," Snape replied. When he left, the room seemed colder. The next turning came not from politics, but from proximity. Nagini had always unsettled Grindelwald, though he said nothing. She moved around Riddle not like a pet, not even like a favored weapon, but like an answer to a question no sane wizard should ask. On an evening of thunder, while the house shook under storm and the Dark Lord's circle waited for some message from the Ministry, Grindelwald found himself alone in the drawing room, except for the snake and the books. Nagini rested by the hearth, scales green-black in the firelight. A goblet of wine stood untouched on the table. The room's silence had the loaded quality common to houses in which every portrait and silver dish might at any time become a witness. Grindelwald turned pages in a worm-eaten manuscript on soul magic and listened to the rain. Herpo the Foul, dismemberment lore, posthumous anchors, protections so blasphemous even dark wizards footnoted them with reluctance. He had read much of this in youth, dismissing most as cowardice disguised as genius. Immortality, for Grindelwald at 20, had been a problem of legacy, not duration. One ruled well enough to persist in institutions. One did not carve oneself into trinkets and pets like a frightened peasant hiding coins under floorboards. Nagini lifted her head. The firelight caught the curve of her eye, and in that instant the wrongness he had felt for months resolved into certainty. Not the whole certainty. Not the count. Not the locations. But the nature of it. The tear in Riddle's soul was not singular. It had been repeated, anchored, distributed, and one of the anchors breathed. A soft tread sounded behind him. Riddle entered without announcement. "You read old filth." Grindelwald closed the book. Sometimes old filth is merely new ambition with better handwriting. Riddle's gaze flicked to the volume, then to the snake, then back. He was too intelligent not to suspect patterns in other minds. Grindelwald wondered whether he knew in that same instant how much had just been understood. "What do you think of immortality, Gellert?" Riddle asked. The old man leaned back in the chair. "I think fear usually asks the question." Riddle's mouth thinned. "And yet every empire desires continuity." "Continuity," said Grindelwald, "is not the same as infestation." A stillness fell. Nagini's tongue flicked once. Riddle came nearer, one white hand resting on the back of the chair opposite. "You disapprove." "I am not required to approve in order to be accurate." "And are you accurate now?" Grindelwald looked up into the red eyes and saw, deeper than temper or vanity, that bottomless panic from which all of Tom Riddle's grandeur ultimately rose. Not fear of death itself. Fear of being subject to any law not of his own making. "Yes," said Grindelwald. "I believe I am." Riddle straightened. "Be careful what you believe." When he was gone, Grindelwald remained motionless by the dying fire. Outside, war was spreading according to patterns he himself had helped draft. Ministries shifted, borders tightened, foreign offices whispered, Britain convulsed. Yet for the first time since escaping Nurmengard, he felt something like genuine revulsion work through him. Not moral horror in the schoolbook sense, but a colder disgust, an aesthetic and structural recognition that Tom Riddle had passed beyond governance. This was no ruler preserving his reign. It was a soul rotting outward through the mechanisms of power. He sat a long time in the dark with Herpo's manuscript under one hand, and the knowledge of the breathing Horcrux settling into place like winter. When at last he rose, the choice before him had altered its shape. He had not joined a conqueror. He had joined a contagion. The message came folded into absence. No owl carried it. No Patronus announced it. One evening in late winter, when Dumbledore returned to his office after an hour spent coaxing a portrait into useful testimony about a memory long buried, he found upon his desk a circle of ash enclosing 3 words written in a hand he had not seen outside nightmares and old drawers in many decades. St. Jude's. Midnight dot. Alone. He stared at the ash until it cooled entirely. St. Jude's was a ruined chapel on a stretch of coast so battered by North Sea weather that even locals had given up trying to attach piety to it. Half the roof was gone. One wall had collapsed long ago into a tangle of stone and marram grass. Smugglers had used it, then adolescents, then no one much at all. It was, which mattered more than its obscurity, a place Dumbledore and Grindelwald had once visited in youth during a summer walk from Godric's Hollow, lured there by a rumor of hidden medieval wards. They had found none. They had instead argued for 3 hours about law, power, and whether secrecy was merely cowardice in ceremonial dress. At midnight the sea was iron, and the wind smelled of salt and old ruin. Snow came slanting over the dunes. Dumbledore entered the chapel through the broken arch and found 3 candles burning in the apse where the altar had been. Their flames bent in the draught, but did not go out. Grindelwald stood by the shattered window. For one impossible instant the years folded badly. The angle of his shoulders, the slight turn of the head at a sound, the profile set against storm. It was too easy to see the boy inside the old man, and therefore too dangerous. Then the illusion failed, as all illusions must. Gellert had become gaunter than any memory could have warned. White hair, lined face, the mouth more severe, the body careful with itself in the way of those acquainted with pain. Only the eyes remained exactly inoffensively the same. "You came," Grindelwald said. "You invited me to a ruin in winter," Dumbledore replied. "That is not an inducement I often resist." The old answer almost invited the old smile. Almost. Grindelwald looked at his left hand instead, where the blackened curse climbed from fingers toward wrist under half-concealing cloth. "You are dying," he said. Dumbledore tucked the hand deeper into his sleeve. "Yes, I dare say. Are we all? Do not use schoolmaster evasions on me, Albus. Then do not open with rudeness, Gellert." The wind moved through broken glass like a slow intake of breath. Candlelight traveled across stone, over their faces, across years. No third person would ever be allowed to narrate honestly. At length Dumbledore said, "Why are you here?" Grindelwald did not answer at once. He crossed to the candles and held one wrinkled hand near the flame, not for warmth but to watch the skin redden and withdraw. "Tom believes himself immortal," he said. "Not metaphorically, not politically, literally. I know. You know generally. I know more." Dumbledore's eyes sharpened. "Go on." Grindelwald looked at him. "He has split his soul more than once." Dumbledore did not move. Yet a deep grief, old as the first suspicion and sharp as confirmation, passed through his face like shadow under clear water. "I thought so," he said quietly. "One part resides in the snake. And the others? I do not know where they all are," Grindelwald said. "Only what he is, a hoarder of himself, an archivist of panic." Dumbledore's gaze dropped briefly to the candles. "Thank you," he said. The phrase landed oddly in the ruined chapel. Gratitude between them had always been the most dangerous currency. Grindelwald laughed under his breath. "Do not thank me too quickly. I am not redeemed because I find him disgusting. I had not intended to confer sainthood. A flare of something, not anger, something more wounded, crossed Grindelwald's expression. "You always did that." "Did what?" "Reduce a man to the moral category in which he least inconveniences you." For a long moment, only the sea answered. Dumbledore looked at him with a sadness that was not defensive. "No," he said. "I believed you capable of worse than ordinary categories. That was the inconvenience." The words landed. Grindelwald turned away. Snow blew through the broken window, dissolving on the stones between them. Outside, the surf struck the shore with the repetitive force of things too ancient to care about human failure. "You should not have joined him," Dumbledore said after a while. Grindelwald gave a short, humorless smile. "I had gathered as much." "Then why?" "Because prison is a poor cure for ambition." He spoke into the dark sea rather than to the man behind him. "Because I felt the shape of his return and wanted to see whether the world had produced a successor or merely a symptom. Because I thought perhaps I could place a hand on the wheel before he overturned the carriage entirely. Because power still interests me. Shall I continue?" Dumbledore said nothing. Grindelwald turned back. "Because I wanted to know," he said more quietly. "What kind of evil required your fear?" The admission hung between them like frost. Dumbledore's expression changed by degrees. "You always mistake my fear for admiration." "Do I?" "Yes." Grindelwald's face tightened. "He is beneath you." "Tom is below many things," Dumbledore said. "That has never prevented him from murdering above his station." For the first time that night, true shared understanding moved between them. Not forgiveness, not ease, but the old, terrible compatibility of minds that once fitted too well. "He cannot bear love," Grindelwald said. "I saw it in the ministry." Dumbledore's eyes flicked up sharply. "You were there." "Yes." "And you stood aside." "Yes." A bitter smile touched Dumbledore's mouth. "How very like you to begin helping only when it can be mistaken for observation." Grindelwald absorbed the blow. Perhaps he had earned 1,000 worse. "You once said," he replied, "that to understand another man's weakness is not mercy until one decides what to do with it. I am here deciding." Dumbledore studied him. "And what have you decided?" "That Tom Riddle does not want a world. He wants an audience for his fear." Grindelwald stepped nearer the candles. "There is no architecture in him, Albus. Only escalation. Even at my worst I understood institutions. He understands only trophies." Dumbledore's voice was very soft. "Even at your worst. Do not flatter me by pretending the distinction comforts anyone." Silence again. Then Dumbledore said, "There are nights in my life I have spent wishing I had gone to Nurmengard sooner." "Why?" "To ask whether you regretted Ariana." The name entered the chapel like a ghost, invited and not dismissed. Grindelwald's hand tightened once at his side. For an instant the white-haired old man vanished, and the brilliant, reckless boy stood naked in the ruin of consequence. "I regret," he said at last, each word precise, "that she died while we argued about the future as if the future had given us permission. I regret that I knew in the instant afterward that I was capable of leaving you with the grief and saving myself the blame. I regret that for many years I called that instinct necessity." Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the candles had burned lower. "That is nearer honesty than I expected." "You always expected honesty. What you never expected was that it might come without kneeling." Dumbledore almost smiled. Perhaps. The wind drove snow across the floor. One candle guttered and recovered. Grindelwald looked again at the blackened hand. "What cursed you?" "A ring," said Dumbledore. There was no reason to say more. No reason, and yet because they stood in the debris of a church and the debris of themselves, Dumbledore added, "My own weakness, largely." For the first time, something like pain without irony crossed Grindelwald's face. The Hallows. Yes. A breath of laughter escaped him then. Astonishment and sorrow twined too tightly to separate. "We are ridiculous." "Often," said Dumbledore. They stood facing each other across the old altar stones. Two men who had once believed the world young enough to be remade by their intellect, and now found themselves old in very different ways. "He will come for the wand," Grindelwald said eventually. Dumbledore's gaze sharpened again. "Not yet, I think. Eventually." "Yes. He does not understand wand lore," said Grindelwald. "He thinks possession is ownership and theft is mastery. A common confusion. Among thieves, yes." A faint, very human weariness entered Dumbledore's features. "Why tell me all this, Gellert?" The old wizard did not answer immediately. He went to the broken window and looked out at the sea until the snow silvered the shoulders of his black coat. "When I was young," he said at last, "I mistook scale for nobility. I thought if an idea was large enough it could wash the blood from the means. Prison did not make me good. Let us not insult each other. But Tom..." He shook his head once. "Tom is small in the soul, Albus. Smaller than fear. He would turn even our worst dreams provincial. That offends me." Dumbledore listened with his face unreadable. Then he said, "If you ever mean to do one decent thing, do it without demanding witness." Grindelwald turned back slowly. "I have never wanted absolution." "No," Dumbledore agreed. "Only witnesses." For a moment it seemed possible that one of them might move the short remaining distance between them. Not toward forgiveness, too late for that, too complicated, but toward some acknowledgement more dangerous, because it was true. Instead, the last candle went out. Darkness folded through the chapel. Snow hissed at the broken window. The sea kept speaking to no one. When Dumbledore stepped back into the night, Grindelwald remained among the ruined stones, a black figure inside the skeleton of old sanctity. Neither man looked back soon enough for the other to see it. By the time summer turned again, all of them were moving inside plans that intersected without fully touching. Dumbledore hunted Horcruxes with the final exactness of a man spending not merely his strength but his remaining hours. Harry learned pieces of a history he had never wished to inherit. Tom Riddle's parentage, his school days, his hunger for relics, the hideous word Horcrux itself. Snape made vows in dark drawing rooms and carried burdens no one thanked him for. Draco Malfoy, who had been raised to think cruelty a form of pedigree, discovered that murder in prospect bears very little resemblance to bravado in a school corridor. At Malfoy Manor, Bellatrix sharpened the boy into panic. Narcissa moved through the house like a prayer, trying not to become a scream. And Grindelwald watched. He watched Draco because he knew what it was to be young and recruited by a vision too large to inspect. He watched Snape because the man's silence had become that of a loaded trap, not inactivity but compression. He watched Riddle because the Dark Lord's patience, when directed toward a child's failure, had the feel of cruelty, enjoyed as art. The more the boy floundered, the more Tom seemed to relish the theater of it. "You waste him," Grindelwald said one night, as Nagini wound through chair legs and thunder rolled over Wiltshire. Riddle, seated by the fire with one long finger on a parchment report from the ministry, did not look up. "He is a lesson to his father. He is 16. Riddle lifted his head then. And children break unpredictably." "Good," said Riddle. "Then one may see what is inside them." Grindelwald's expression cooled toward blankness. "That is the language of a torturer, not a ruler." Riddle's smile was slight. "Why do you persist in imagining those roles distinct?" No answer that mattered could be spoken in that room. "Grindelwald, let the silence turn hard between them and left. He learned, through old instincts rather than evidence, that the night on which Albus Dumbledore went to the cave would not end quietly. There are patterns to ambushes, to traps sprung by boys under pressure, to spells layered too thickly in the air around a place. As the evening darkened over Hogwarts and storm clouds massed beyond the hills, Grindelwald took a path through Hogsmeade under concealment and stood at the edge of the forbidden forest among pines black as ink. From there, the castle seemed both ancient and impossibly vulnerable. Lit windows and towers, the moving shadows of patrols, the hint of life behind stone. He had once dreamed of taking such a place. Now he stood below it, feeling only the old sting of recognition that institutions, however grand, are always one wrong hand from desecration. Up in the astronomy tower, Harry and Dumbledore returned from poison and lake water, from deathly cave and false triumph, to find the castle already betrayed. The scene that followed would later be told in clean strokes by those who needed legends. Draco disarming the weakened headmaster, the Death Eaters spilling in, Snape climbing the tower at the last, the green jet of Avada Kedavra against black sky. But clean stories are rarely true enough. Draco's hand shook so badly the wand looked alive with it. Dumbledore, gray with pain, stood not as a defeated man but as one already beyond personal fear. His voice, Harry would remember forever, held pity even then. The Death Eaters jostled behind the boy, vulgar with excitement. Below the tower, the storm pressed closer. And somewhere beyond the wards, among pines wet with coming rain, Grindelwald felt the shape of the moment gather before he could yet see it. Then Snape arrived. From the ground, Grindelwald saw only the outline. Black robes, tower edge, lightning. But some patterns need no clarity. When the green light erupted into the sky and the body fell, every old ward in the grounds seemed to shudder. The castle took the death into itself like a struck bell takes sound. In the forest, Grindelwald made a noise he had not made in 50 years. Not since prison, not since Ariana. A low, involuntary breath, as if the world had driven iron through him by surprise. Rain broke. He might have gone up then. He might have forced the gates, challenged Snape, fought the fleeing Death Eaters on the grounds like some late tragic hero in a tale he would once have mocked. Instead, he stood among the pines while the rain came down and saw, with terrible sudden clarity, the one thing that stopped him. Snape had not moved like a man seizing opportunity. He had moved like a man obeying sentence. Whatever had just happened bore the shape of design, not spontaneity. Albus, then, had known. The realization did not soften the grief. It only made it lonelier. By dawn, the news had spread. The castle mourned. The order gathered. Harry walked through the hours like a person learning that hatred can be postponed by astonishment but not prevented. Grindelwald did not leave the grounds. Hidden under disillusionment and old fieldcraft, he remained among the edges of Hogwarts until the funeral. The white tomb by the lake seemed at first an obscenity of beauty. Dumbledore had always understood ceremony better than he admitted. Even his death arranged itself into symbols others might survive by. Students and professors stood in black. The giant squid's tentacles stirred below the bright water. Centaurs watched from the forest margin. Fox's lament, if heard, belonged to no creature remaining present long enough to verify it. Beyond the yews, unseen by all, Grindelwald stood with rain drying in the seams of his coat and watched the coffin vanish into marble. He had thought, in some cold, proud part of himself, that he had long since finished being vulnerable to Albus' existence. Prison had helped with that fiction. Years had helped. Defeat had helped. What undid it was not romance. Time had burned too many shapes out of that, but the simpler cruelty of finality. There would be no more arguments. No more looking across a room and finding the one other mind in it capable of offending, matching, and understanding him in equal measure. The last witness to their youth had become stone. That night at Malfoy Manor, Riddle presided over council like a king hosting weather. "Dumbledore is dead," Bellatrix said, radiant with triumph. "The school will fall, The ministry will follow. We are free. You are noisy, said Grindelwald. Her smile vanished. You dare. Yes, said Grindelwald. I dare. Continually. No. Riddle, seated with fingers steepled, watched them both. The red eyes shone in the candlelight like banked embers. You disapprove of victory, he said. I disapprove of waste, Grindelwald answered. A recurring complaint. You have killed the only wizard in Europe who understood what to do with power once it was won. Riddle's expression did not change. Then the burden is mine alone. No, said Grindelwald. The burden is precisely what you never wanted. Constraint. Succession. Institutions that outlast admiration. He could have ruled and chose not to. You could never choose because rule, to you, is only the absence of denial. The room went silent enough to hear wax settling in candle cups. Bellatrix rose, wand out in a single fluid motion. My lord, let me kill him. Riddle lifted one finger. She froze. How moving, he said softly. That grief should make you honest. Grindelwald's gaze did not leave his. Honesty is wasted on sycophants. I reserve it for rivals. The word rippled through the room like poison. Riddle stood. For a heartbeat magic thickened so densely that the curtains stirred though the windows were shut. The portraits flinched in their frames. Bellatrix's breath came fast with anticipatory ecstasy. Lucius stared at the floor. Then Riddle smiled. A terrible, elegant thing. Not yet, he said. The pressure eased by degrees. Grindelwald inclined his head once, not in submission but acknowledgement of a postponed violence, and turned away. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he went to the library and burned 3 files he himself had created, names of foreign sympathizers, routes through old safe houses, leverage points in ministries not yet compromised. The flames rose white and soundless in the grate. It was not repentance. Repentance belonged to a moral arithmetic he had never trusted. It was simply decision. By morning, the alliance had not formally ended. In practical terms, however, the crack ran from ceiling to foundation. The Ministry of Magic would fall soon. Britain would enter its darkest year. Tom Riddle would stride into open dominion convinced he had at last removed the only wizard capable of opposing him directly. But another old wizard had begun, in the ashes of a library fire, to decide what betrayal ought to mean. The ministry fell as rotten doors fall, suddenly after years of insisting their hinges are sound. With Rufus Scrimgeour murdered, pious thickness enthralled, and bureaucratic terror elevated to principle, Britain entered that peculiar phase of authoritarianism in which forms were still stamped, desks still organized, lunch breaks still observed, and all the while the machinery of humiliation tightened its grip around entire categories of human life. Muggle-born registration commissions convened with the brisk obscenity of civil procedure. Dolores Umbridge smiled over parchment while families vanished. Snatchers combed roads and hedgerows, with the enthusiasm of petty men granted moral permission to be predators. Grindelwald watched the new regime harden and felt no satisfaction. Tom's state, if it could be called that, had the architecture of panic everywhere. Decrees multiplied faster than strategic gains. Public punishments outpaced institutional control. Bellatrix and her kind bloomed in the atmosphere like mold after floodwater. So he began to steal from the empire he had helped refine. A clerk's son disappeared from a holding cell in Bristol and was found 3 days later in France with his memory hazy and his life intact. 2 sisters from Liverpool vanished during transit to a hearing and reappeared under new names in Belgium. A Muggle-born healer, 2 apprentice wand-makers, and a terrified schoolboy were smuggled through an abandoned monastery cellar on the old Austrian route Grindelwald had once reserved for arms. Those who survived such passages whispered afterward of a white-haired man who never gave his name and never accepted thanks. Some said ghost. Some said traitor. Some said the devil had grown tired of worse company. In the forests outside Berlin, one of his oldest hidden caches was burned after use. In Denmark, an entire contact chain was severed because he suspected it compromised. In Wiltshire, Bellatrix screamed for blood when a transport of prisoners went missing between checkpoints, and only their shackles were found in a ditch. Riddle said very little. That was how one knew he had begun to understand. Harry, meanwhile, wandered the country inside a war far too old and too large for 17-year-olds, carrying Dumbledore's unfinished task with the angry devotion of the unwilling inheritor. He, Ron and Hermione camped in woods, fields, riverbanks, hills. They listened to Potterwatch when they dared. They argued. They starved. They hunted Horcruxes with incomplete clues and increasing desperation. The world narrowed to cold ground, stolen food, whispered plans, and the heavy knowledge that all the adults who should have known better had left them a scavenger hunt through apocalypse. Now and then, rumor crossed their path. Dean Thomas heard of an old foreign wizard seen near the Channel escape routes. Ted Tonks mentioned, in one exhausted half-skeptical breath, a silver-haired man who had stunned 3 snatchers in Yorkshire and vanished before the refugees he helped could ask his name. Hermione, hearing the fragments, went white in the firelight. "It can't be," she said. Harry looked up from the useless daily prophet he had been pretending to read. "Who?" She hesitated, as if naming the possibility might help summon it. "Grindelwald." Ron swore softly. "You're joking." "I am not." Harry felt his scar prickle for reasons that had nothing to do with Voldemort. Why would he help anyone? Hermione shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe he isn't. Maybe it's just stories." But Harry remembered the white-haired figure in dreams, in the Ministry, on the margins of things. He remembered Dumbledore saying an old danger had entered a new war. The idea that danger might shift, might choose new alignments for reasons no one noble would ever find comfortable, made his skin crawl. Christmas approached under clouds and hunger. When Harry proposed going to Godric's Hollow, Hermione understood at once that refusal was impossible. The village held his parents' graves, Bathilda Bagshot's house, perhaps answers about Dumbledore, about the Hollows, about everything. So they went. Snow lay over the lane like clean deceit. The churchyard stones wore frost. Windows glowed with ordinary domestic Christmas behind curtains, while the statue of the Potter family in the square transformed itself by turns into memorial and faceless stone. Harry stood before his parents' grave with snow gathering on his hair and the epitaph blurring under tears he was too tired to hide. Beside him, Hermione cried quietly, arm through his. A short distance away, hidden in the church arched shadow beneath a winter hood, and spells that bent casual notice elsewhere, Grindelwald watched. He had come to Godric's Hollow 3 nights earlier because the place had acquired too many meanings to be left unwatched. Bathilda was dead, or worse. Riddle's interest in the village had sharpened. The old house where he and Albus had once spoken like kings in waiting still stood in ruinous memory on another lane. And Christmas, for reasons that would have disgusted him in youth, had made him restless. Now he saw the boy. Harry Potter looked smaller in grief than in legend. The scar was only a scar. The shoulders were too young. Yet when he read the words on James and Lily Potter's stone, and stood there refusing to look away, Grindelwald understood something that books and rumors had not conveyed. The child who had survived Tom had not become powerful because he loved being exceptional. He had become dangerous because he kept walking back toward loss and calling it duty. It was the sort of thing Albus would have chosen. Hermione drew Harry onward at last toward Bathilda Bagshot's cottage. Grindelwald hesitated only once before following at a distance through the narrow snowy lane. The house exhaled wrongness. Windows filmed over. Garden dead under frost. Silence too complete, as if normal decay had been asked to impersonate itself. When Bathilda appeared in the doorway to admit Harry inside, Grindelwald saw at once what the boy, with history and hope warring in him, could not. The angle of the old woman's movements. The vacancy. The smell. Nagini. He swore softly and quickened his pace. Too late to prevent entry. perhaps not too late to salvage exit. Inside the cottage, events exploded faster than thought. Harry followed the thing wearing Bathilda upstairs. The serpent emerged, enormous and gleaming, bursting from the skin of a dead woman as from a cloak. Hermione's scream split the house below. The room thrashed with wreckage, broken furniture, old photographs spinning from walls. Voldemort, across whatever hideous link bound him to the snake, began to arrive in consciousness, if not yet body. Grindelwald hit the front door with a blasting charm just as Hermione hurled one of her own from the stairwell. The house shook. Nagini struck. Harry's holly wand flared, then snapped in a burst of golden pain. For a single terrible instant, the boy was half buried in collapsing plaster with the snake coming again. A white lance of fire crossed the room from the doorway and severed the attack by inches. Nagini recoiled, scales smoking. Hermione seized Harry. Apparition cracked through the cottage like torn fabric. The two children vanished into night. By the time Voldemort's awareness fully slammed through the snake into the ruin, Grindelwald was the only wizard left in the room. For a heartbeat, the link between them became nearly visible. Tom's red fury pouring through reptile eyes into the wreckage, Grindelwald standing amid shattered timber, and Bathilda's long-ransacked secrets, snow spinning through the broken wall. "So," said the old man to the serpent, and therefore to its master. At last. Nagini lunged. He met her with a curse that threw her through the remains of a wardrobe and into the dark. She escaped through a blasted window a second later in a torrent of glass and snow, too valuable to Tom to spend recklessly while the master himself still traveled toward the site in body. Grindelwald had no intention of being there when he arrived. He crossed the ruined parlor once, pausing only by a fallen photograph face down in the ash. Bathilda Bagshot's younger selves smiled up from it with a summer expression undamaged by knowledge. He set the photograph gently into the fire and watched it curl. Then he left through the wrecked doorway into the snow. Miles away, in a frozen field, Harry woke from the aftershock with his broken wand in Hermione's hands and an old face burning behind his eyes. "There was someone there," he said. Hermione, exhausted and shaking, pressed the snapped holly pieces together helplessly. "Only the snake." "No." Harry sat up too fast, visions swimming. At the door, an old man. She stared at him. "Harry, you were half crushed." "I know what I saw." Ron, absent then and needed more than either would admit, could not settle the argument. The night stretched around them, cold and wounded. In Hogsmeade at the Hog's Head, Aberforth Dumbledore found a note slipped beneath his door the following afternoon, in a hand he recognized with instant hatred. "When the boy comes, do not turn him away." He almost burned it unread. Instead, he folded it once and shoved it into his pocket with a muttered curse on all brilliant men, and the trouble they believed themselves entitled to create. The war kept moving. Malfoy Manor would soon see blood and house elves and rescue. Shell Cottage would see grief and wands and the first true shape of the Hallows. Tom would turn toward the Elder Wand in hunger. Harry would piece together histories from fragments and lies. But after Godric's Hollow, one certainty hardened in Grindelwald's mind beyond even the knowledge of the breathing Horcrux. Albus had not only chosen the boy, he had trusted him to finish what older men had ruined. Betrayal, once begun, has a taste that clarifies. After Godric's Hollow and the increasing failures of the regime to hold what it seized, Riddle's patience with uncertainty thinned to menace. Bellatrix clamored for permission to hunt Grindelwald openly. Yaxley suggested foreign agents had overestimated their value. Snape said almost nothing, which was wise. Lucius, restored only fractionally after the disaster of his house and prisoners escaping from it, avoided every room in which the old wizard's name might be spoken. Riddle did not accuse immediately. That was not his style when he was most dangerous. Instead, he grew courteous. "Where were you?" he asked one evening at table. "On Christmas night?" "Traveling," said Grindelwald. "Where?" "Between irrelevancies." Bellatrix's wand scraped half out of her sleeve. Riddle only smiled. "You grow evasive." "I grow bored." And yet you remain." Grindelwald laid down his fork. "Do I?" 3 days later he was gone from Malfoy Manor. He did not flee blindly. He took little: a serviceable wand, 2 books, 1 packet of letters, a purse of coin, and the names of no one who could be tortured into betraying roots he now meant to destroy. He burned another cache, then a second. In Belgium he obliterated a contact list with dragon fire and watched the parchment turn to gray curls. In northern France he sent 2 refugees onward with false papers and no memory of his face. In Germany he crossed a frozen field beneath moonlight and understood, with some surprise, that the destination toward which he now traveled had been waiting for him all along. Nurmengard. No place on earth knew him better. No place on earth had more right to despise him. And no place offered such exact symbolic insult to Tom Riddle as the notion that their alliance should end beneath the motto Grindelwald himself had once carved. He reached the fortress under storm as he had left it. The outer wards had been partially repaired after his escape, but not with elegance. They yielded under his hand and memory. The great gates stood dark against the mountain, for the greater good streaked with rain. He entered the ruined court and moved through corridors stripped by years of neglect, touching stone as if reacquainting himself with bones. There were things here still worth destroying. Records, half-burned inventories, old codes, draft maps of a Europe he had once planned to reorder by coercion and brilliance. He carried armfuls of them into the courtyard and fed them to white fire while thunder rolled over the peaks. Pages curled. Ink ran out. Ambition became smoke. "Bonfires," came Riddle's voice from the gate. "How sentimental." Grindelwald turned. Tom stood beneath the arch in black robes whipped by mountain wind, pale face made ghastly by lightning. No entourage. No Bellatrix. No snake. Some conversations require privacy because they are, in essence, executions. "You found me," Grindelwald said. Riddle stepped forward over wet stone. "Did you imagine you had become difficult to trace?" "No, merely inconvenient." The red eyes flicked to the burning papers. "Destroying your own history? Curating it?" Riddle's wand lay easy in his hand. "You have been meddling in my affairs." "Your affairs?" said Grindelwald. "Have included transporting children in chains, enthroning sadists in offices, and using a dead woman's body as a sheath for your pet. My meddling has been an act of hygiene." Green light blasted past his shoulder an instant before the sentence finished. Grindelwald moved not quickly but correctly, and the curse shattered stone where he had been. His answer was not a killing spell. White fire roared up from the flagstones between them, curving into a wall that split the courtyard in 2. Rain hissed into steam. "I warned you," Riddle said through the flame. "You bored me," Grindelwald answered. The duel that followed would never be recorded accurately. No witnesses stood on the walls. No future textbook would dare the complexity of it. Power met power across a court, built for a younger tyranny, each man knowing too much of darkness to underestimate the other. Riddle fought with a kind of savage elegance, spells aimed not merely to kill but to annihilate. Green curses. Cutting hexes that shrieked through rain. Serpentine chains of black smoke that sought the throat and wrists. Grindelwald's defense was older in style, sharper in geometry. Shields of interlocking light, transfigured stone, counter curses designed less to overpower than to redirect catastrophe into architecture. Columns exploded. Stairs sheared away. The carved motto above the gates split down the middle under a curse that missed by inches. "You should have stayed in your cell," Riddle shouted over the thunder. "You should have stayed mortal." Grindelwald flung back. A blasting curse struck the parapet. Black stones rained into the yard. Grindelwald's shoulder jerked as a splintered shard sliced through coat and flesh. Pain lit his arm. He ignored it and sent a ribbon of white flame racing across the wet ground. Riddle leapt, robes snapping, and answered with a curse so dark the rain itself seemed briefly to reverse and fall upward around it. They broke apart, circling. Above them, lightning revealed the fortress towers, the mountains, the ravine beyond. Below them, old slogans cracked under new war. Riddle's expression had changed. He was no longer merely punishing treachery. He was furious in that rare, intimate way reserved for those who had seen too clearly. "You think yourself superior because you failed differently," he hissed. Grindelwald, breathing hard now, blood warm under soaked cloth, gave a ragged laugh. "No, Tom. I think myself superior because I know what power is for." "What is it for?" "Not this." The answer landed harder than any curse. Riddle attacked with renewed violence. Grindelwald met him spell for spell until the years began to exact their debt. His arms slowed. His lungs burned. The stolen strength of fury and purpose could not indefinitely disguise that one of them was still in the raw, cruel middle of his power, and the other long past his prime, surviving now on cunning, experience, and the same will that had once terrified a continent. Riddle saw the weakening and pressed. A curse struck Grindelwald's wand arm full on, numbing the hand. Another shattered the stone at his feet and threw him against the base of the gate. Pain flared white across his vision. Before he fully righted himself, Riddle was there, wand at his throat, face inches away and rain running down the flat, inhuman plains of it. "You know about the wand," Riddle said. The words came low, intense, stripped of theatricality. Not the Elder Wand as rumor, the wand as obsession. Grindelwald looked at him through rain. "I know many things. Who was master after you?" The old man smiled despite the blood in his mouth. Still asking the wrong question. Riddle pressed the wand harder under his jaw. "Answer." "Albus Dumbledore defeated me," Grindelwald said. "You knew that. Then why does it not obey me?" There it was. Not pure demand. Confusion. Fury edged with fear. "Because you think death is ownership," Grindelwald thought. "Because you understand trophies and not allegiance. Because mastery passes through living defiance, and all your triumphs are over things you have already reduced." Aloud he said, "It will never love you." Riddle's face twisted, not because the words were precise, but because they were intolerably imprecise, offensive in the very way Wandlore always offended him, by implying that power might have laws not authored by his desire. The curse he cast then was not lethal. It was worse. Pain seared through Grindelwald from throat to spine, dropping him to one knee. The world narrowed to storm and stone and the smell of old prison rain. "You helped the boy," Riddle said. "Yes." "You warned Aberforth." "Yes." "You told Dumbledore about the snake." Grindelwald, half-blinded, laughed again. Too late, wasn't it? Riddle lifted the wand for the killing blow. At the last instant, Grindelwald struck the gate behind himself with the heel of his injured hand. Hidden mechanisms older than both the prison repairs and the Alliance answered. The flagstones under Riddle's feet split. One side of the inner wall collapsed outward in a roar of stone and water long primed to obey emergency runes. The courtyard became chaos. Grindelwald rolled clear by instinct older than dignity. Riddle, fast enough to save himself from the drop, vanished in a crack of apparition before the falling masonry could pin him. The mountain answered with thunder. Silence came in fragments. When Grindelwald dragged himself upright, half the gate lay shattered, and the words "for the greater good" had been reduced to "for the gree," in a jagged void. Rain washed blood into the cracks between stones. He stood there swaying, one hand braced on the broken arch, and thought with exhausted clarity that old monuments had a sense of humor after all. He knew where Tom would go next. To the White Tomb. To Dumbledore. To the Elder Wand physically taken at last from the dead, he believed, defeated. The thought might have drawn Grindelwald into pursuit once. It did not now. Harry Potter, if Albus had judged correctly, was nearer the center of this than any older man could forcefully become. There remained, however, one thing the boy needed which Tom did not yet know he possessed. By dawn, Grindelwald, wounded and gray under the eyes, crossed the threshold of the Hog's Head through the back way and found Aberforth Dumbledore polishing a glass with the murderous expression of a man who has learned the world will always send him more trouble than customers. The glass dropped. For a breath, they simply stared at one another. Then Aberforth reached for his wand. "Get out!" Grindelwald swayed once against the doorframe and straightened by force. "Not yet. You have a great deal of nerve walking in here." "Yes. I should kill you." "Yes." Aberforth's face went hard as the mountain itself. For Ariana. The name, in that room, had no theatrics left in it. Only rawness. Grindelwald bowed his head the smallest possible degree. "You would be late," he said, "but justified." Aberforth's wand did not lower. "Then why are you here?" "Because the boy will come." Grindelwald's breath hitched. Pain wanted more of him than he intended to give. "And because one of Tom's souls breathes in the snake." At that, for the first time, Aberforth's expression changed from hatred to attention. "You'll tell him yourself. If he arrives before I fall over," Grindelwald said, and nearly smiled. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione came through the tunnel from the Hog's Head into Hogwarts, they expected many things. Suspicion, urgency, battle, perhaps Aberforth's bitterness carried further than rescue. They did not expect to find Gellert Grindelwald seated in the back room beside a dead fire, one arm bound in blood-stained linen, looking as though he had been carved out of old winter and left briefly to thaw. Hermione made a strangled sound of recognition. Ron's hand went to his wand at once. Harry stopped dead. Aberforth, standing behind the bar with both hands flat upon it, looked from one to the other as if daring anyone to make the scene more intolerable. "That," he said, jerking his chin toward Grindelwald, "is today's additional disaster." Harry stared at the old man. The face from history books, from Dumbledore's past, from dreams and the ruins of Bathilda's cottage, now sat before him in flesh and damage. It was nearly impossible to fit the legend and the reality together. He looked more like a retired executioner than a conqueror. Yet the room seemed arranged around the fact of him despite its contempt. "You," Harry said. "Yes," Grindelwald answered. Ron raised his wand fully. "Tell me why I shouldn't curse him now." "Because you'll miss," said Grindelwald. "You're angry." Hermione stepped forward before Ron could answer. "You were with Voldemort. For a time. You helped him." "Yes. And now you're here because what, exactly? You've decided to become useful." Grindelwald looked at her with something almost like approval. "Sharp girl." Harry moved closer, eyes fixed on the old wizard's face. "You were in Godric's Hollow." "Yes. You saved us." Grindelwald tilted his head. "I interrupted a snake. Let us not embroider." Aberforth made an impatient noise. "If we're done admiring history's rubbish, there's a war on." Harry ignored him. "Why help us?" For the first time, real fatigue showed in Grindelwald. "Because Albus chose you. Because Tom mistakes terror for structure. Because one can only stand beside a man while he mutilates the world if one wishes to become his shape." "Must I continue?" "Nanda." Harry thought of Dumbledore, of the White Tomb, of all the things the headmaster had known and not said. "Did Professor Dumbledore know you'd do this?" "No," said Grindelwald. "Albus knew only that I was still capable of choosing poorly. On that point, we had abundant evidence." Hermione's gaze sharpened. "You know about the Horcruxes?" "Yes." "How many?" "Enough that counting them became a pathology." "One of the remaining fragments," Grindelwald said, looking directly at Harry now, "lives in the snake." Harry felt the words strike into a place in him that had already begun to form the same shape. Not surprise, exactly. Confirmation. Nagini. The visions, the protectiveness, the wrongness. Dumbledore's hints and Snape's memories not yet seen. The snake. Ron swore. Hermione inhaled sharply. Aberforth muttered something savage under his breath about brilliant fools and unfinished sentences. "How do you know?" Harry asked. Grindelwald's mouth thinned. Because Tom is vulgar in his immortality. Because I know the smell of soul magic done badly. Because I have eyes. Naive. There was no time for more. Neville burst in with messages from the room of requirement. The Carrows were on the move. Death Eaters closing. The castle waking into resistance around them. Harry looked once more at Grindelwald and saw, beneath all contempt he might rightly feel, a terrible, uncomfortable usefulness. "Can you fight?" he asked. The old man stood. He swayed, then steadied. "I can still offend." That was enough. The Battle of Hogwarts tore itself into being by corridor, stairwell, broken window, shouted password, and sparks in the dark. Statues rose. Suits of armor marched. Professors flung protections over towers. Students who should have been revising for examinations instead carried stretchers, torches, potions, and whatever remained of their childhoods. The defenders expected monsters at the gates and got them. Giants. Acromantulas. Death Eaters ecstatic with ideology or terror or both. And among them, to the astonishment of all who saw him, moved Grindelwald. He did not command. That would have been intolerable in 100 ways. He fought where collapse threatened. In the lower corridors he turned a barrage of curses aside long enough for first years to flee. On a staircase he disarmed Yaxley with a spell so swift and economical that the man had time only for outrage before he tumbled backward into his own followers. In a courtyard he met Antonin Dolohov under burning battlements and drove him through 3 successive shield walls before leaving him stunned among rubble for younger defenders to bind. Students who later described the old wizard could never agree on what color his magic had been. White, some said. Silver. Blue as storm edges. Like lightning forced to think. Bellatrix found him near the viaduct in the thick of midnight. For one suspended instant both simply looked at each other across firelight and flying curses, old hatred meeting older disappointment. "Traitor!" she hissed. "At last?" Grindelwald said. She attacked like a singer taking a stage she has long awaited. Her power was real, wild, vicious, sharpened by fanatic joy. He parried and yielded ground with the precision of age, letting her fury extend itself into openings. Green light scorched stone. Her laughter rang. His replies came silent and clean. Had the duel continued uninterrupted, perhaps one of them would have ended the other. It did not. Bellatrix saw Ginny Weasley to one side, broke away with delighted malice, and hurled her attention toward easier prey. Grindelwald turned to intervene, and in that heartbeat Molly Weasley arrived like judgment too long deferred. What followed belonged to mothers in grief, and Grindelwald, breathing hard, did not step between them. Hours blurred. Fred died. Lupin died. Tonks died. The castle accumulated the names of the beloved and the broken with war's usual obscene speed. Harry vanished into the forest. Voldemort called Parley die. Silence, then horror. Then the return of the dead not dead boy, carried inward by Hagrid's grief. Through all of it, Grindelwald remained, increasingly pale, blood seeping again through his binding, eyes fixed not on strategy now, but on the converging inevitability of the final mistake. Tom believed the Elder Wand his because he had desecrated a grave, and later murdered Severus Snape, still misunderstanding every law he had not authored. Harry knew otherwise, or would speak it soon enough. The pattern was almost complete. When Neville Longbottom burst from the crowd before the Dark Lord with rebellion blazing through fear, when the Sorting Hat burned and the sword came flashing free, Grindelwald moved at the same instant Tom did. Not to seize glory. To create one opening. His curse struck the stone near Voldemort's feet, exploding the floor in white flame and forcing the Dark Lord sideways in reflexive anger. That half-second was enough. Neville's blade came down. Nagini's head fell, and with it the last outer certainty of Tom Riddle's invulnerability. The scream that ripped from Voldemort then sounded more private than rage. It was the sound of a man discovering too late that even after all his mutilations he remained subject to sequence, to consequence, to ends. The great hall became a chamber of ash, smoke, and held breath. Harry stepped forward out of the crowd. The exchange that followed cut cleaner than any duel. Harry's voice, hoarse and steady, carried through cracked stone and over the bodies of the dead. He named Snape's loyalty. He named the Elder Wand's allegiance. He named the error at the center of Voldemort's every victory. The belief that death conferred ownership, that murder secured mastery, that fear was the only bond worth understanding. Around the edges of the hall, survivors listened with the stunned intimacy of people who realize history is being corrected in their hearing. Grindelwald stood near a shattered pillar. One hand braced against it, and watched Tom Riddle finally be told the truth he had been too arrogant to learn. "You dare," Voldemort began. Harry raised the holly wand he had repaired. "I know things you don't know, Tom." The use of the old name struck like a slap. Grindelwald almost smiled despite blood at the corner of his mouth. There was Albus in that too. Not the cruelty of renaming, but the stripping away of chosen myth. "Voldemort cast first." "Of course he did," Harry answered. Red and green met in the center of the ruined hall, and for a suspended instant, the entire castle seemed to lean toward the collision. Then the Elder Wand, faithful not to grave robbery nor murder, but to the chain of living defeats that had passed from Dumbledore to Draco to Harry, refused its wielder. The killing curse rebounded. Tom Riddle's own body struck the floor with the mundane finality he had spent a lifetime trying to escape. No thunder followed. No earthquake. No divine endorsement. Only silence. And then the first disbelieving breaths of the living. Harry stood shaking. Around him the hall slowly re-entered time. Ron reached him first, then Hermione. Their faces were smoke-streaked, wild, relieved, broken, alive. McGonagall sank onto a bench as if the years had at last taken their due. Hagrid wept openly. Molly clutched Ginny. Neville lowered the sword. Somewhere behind them, Dawn was beginning to think about the horizon. Grindelwald pushed himself away from the pillar. Harry saw him and, after the first stunned press of victory and grief, crossed the wreckage between them. For a moment they stood amid cracked stone and cooling ash, the boy who had ended one darkness and the old man who had once authored another. "You could have tried to take over," Harry said. Grindelwald looked toward Tom's fallen body. "Could I? You know what I mean." "Yes," said Grindelwald. He seemed suddenly older than ever, not from years but from the release of strain. "No, not this time." Harry searched his face for something that might resemble remorse, and found instead complexity so weathered it almost passed for honesty. "Why really?" he asked. Grindelwald considered the ruined hall, the dead, the children holding bloodied wands, the first pale light touching broken windows. "Because Albus believed the world could still be trusted to those who had not yet learned to despise it," he said. "Because Tom made even me remember that there are limits beyond which ambition ceases to be grand and becomes merely diseased. Because once, long ago, I confused love of power with love of the future, and I had no wish to watch him make that confusion the only law left standing. Meh, amor, mentri, amai into all." Harry absorbed this without liking it, which was perhaps the only fitting response. "People will want you arrested. People have wanted many things of me. Will you let them?" Grindelwald's gaze moved past him to the lake, where somewhere beyond the walls, a white tomb stood empty of its wand and full of its meaning. "No," he said. "I have spent enough of my life in monuments." He straightened with visible effort. In the doorway behind Harry, Aberforth watched with a face carved from all the resentments history had earned. Their eyes met once. No forgiveness passed. Only acknowledgement, and even that begrudging. "Tell no lies about me," Grindelwald said to Harry. Harry thought of Dumbledore, of all the truths that had arrived late and untidily. "I won't." "Good. Good." The old wizard turned and walked through the ruined hall before anyone thought to stop him. Perhaps they were too exhausted. Perhaps victory had emptied their hands for a moment of anything but the need to touch the living nearest them. Perhaps history itself hesitated, unsure whether to reclaim one of its monsters or let him wander off into the lesser punishment of survival. By the time the sun fully broke over Hogwarts, Gellert Grindelwald was gone from the grounds. Some said later that he was seen crossing the bridge alone, black coat brightening at the edges in dawn. Others insisted he had vanished at the gate. A few believed he had never truly been there at all, only a rumor born of smoke, old photographs, and the tendency of wars to attract legends after the killing ends. Harry, Hermione, Ron, Aberforth, and a very small number of others knew better. They also knew how little certainty the truth would give anyone. Years later, the battle would be told in cleaner shapes. Harry Potter, Lord Voldemort. The courage of students, the loyalty of teachers, the dead honored, and the living mended as best they could. It was right that way, perhaps. The world cannot endure forever, if every victory must carry the full, untidy freight of every soul that brushed it. But on the morning after the Dark Lord fell, when Harry briefly stood alone beside the lake before returning the Elder Wand to its proper resting place, he looked across the water at the White Tomb and understood something Dumbledore had likely known all along. There are men who seek to own history, and men who are punished by becoming part of it, and men who spend their whole lives discovering too late which they are. For the first time in his life, Gellert Grindelwald had left a battlefield without believing it belonged to him.